Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Voice of Authority webinar, brought to you today by Skyrim and the Key Worker Homes Fund. It's been a couple of weeks since we were last together, and it's great to be back. My name is Toby Fox. I'm the Managing Director of 3Fox, the marketing agency for councils. As regular viewers will know, our job is to keep our network of councils and developers and investors and their influencers and advisors connected. And we used to love doing that at physical events, but during lockdown, we've been doing that through this channel, the Voice of Authority, a platform for councils to discuss their ambitions and challenges and influences and issues of urgency. As we make our way through lockdown 3, we're more determined than ever to keep that conversation going and keep our network communicating. And to that end, we're going to be back next Tuesday at 2 p.m. with a special half-term edition entitled Making Safe Spaces for Learning. We're going to be with Wilmot Dixon and a great panel who will be discussing how COVID-19 has influenced thinking around classroom and school design and opened up some fascinating new opportunities for collaboration. You can register to watch that at thevoiceofauthority.co.uk. And if you've already signed up for free membership, either at thevoiceofauthority.co.uk or our LinkedIn members group, you'll be receiving updates on more compelling themes and topics that are coming up in the next few months. And you'll also be getting our invitation for you to get involved. Do get in touch. We look forward to working with you. Now, back to today and the third and final part of our knowledge exchange, a series of events that's supporting the Key Worker Homes Fund invitation to councils and housing associations to bid for an initial fund of £100 million to enable the delivery of homes for key workers. The fund is one part of disruptor developer Skyrim's plan to deliver over 10,000 homes for London's key workers in mutually beneficial partnerships with London's local authorities and housing associations. And why? Because COVID-19 has brought long overdue recognition of the critical role that key workers play in supporting society and sustaining our cities. It's thanks to their efforts that we can live as free and educated and safe people. And the movement in spring 2020 to clap for key workers demonstrated a collective appreciation, but we all know that they deserve more than applause. The levels of exhaustion evident among key workers now under relentless pandemic pressure for just about a year mean that it's more urgent than ever to permanently improve key workers' quality of life. So how should that £100 million be invested to best effect? Joining us today to help answer that question, it's a real pleasure to welcome our excellent panel in alphabetical order. Philip Glanville, the Mayor of Hackney, and Arthur Kay, Chair at the Key Worker Homes Fund. Councillor Anthony Okereke, who's the Cabinet Member for Housing at the Royal Borough of Greenwich, and Maria Smith, who is Director of Sustainability and Physics at Bureau Happold. Now, I've got the best job in the world because I get to have a conversation over the next hour with these brilliant minds. And you viewers can join in. You can use the Q&A to fire in questions all the way through the next hour to fuel our discussion. And by all means, use the chat to share your thoughts with other viewers. We've also got a few surveys and polls for you, so you can contribute by responding to those when they pop up on your screens. The themes today are around sustainable urban development solutions. In particular, I want to explore the dilemma presented by, on the one hand, a housing crisis that demands that we deliver more homes for Londoners, and on the other, that that building those homes is going to produce 40% of annual UK carbon emissions. So let's start that conversation by exploring some of unpacking some of the aspects of that by asking the Mayor of Hackney, first of all, Philip. Can you talk a little bit about housing delivery requirements, Philip, and how feasible they are, and whether or not local authorities are on track to meet them?
Thanks, Toby, and obviously a huge set of topics that we're talking about today. But just to sort of start where you asked me to, I think we saw going into the pandemic, obviously quite an uplift in net delivery in London. I think we went up to as high as 42,000 net additional homes. That's a big improvement on the previous decade. But I think we've all seen, whether we're direct developers or planning authorities or strategic leaders in London, real challenges during the course of the year. And I don't think any of us really know quite what the housing market will look like coming out. And I say that when I say housing market, because ultimately, whether we're local authority builders, housing associations, housing campaigners, the market is what we operate in. We try and shape it, we try and influence it, we try and disrupt it, as the Key Worker Homes Fund is trying to do. But that market is still there, and it's providing a huge amount of cross subsidy that obviously allows us to deliver genuinely affordable homes, but also some of the green infrastructure that I think we're talking about. And what hasn't changed out there is the high levels of housing need. 120,000 children in temporary accommodation. Your point about key workers, what I've seen as a local authority leader doing calls like this is so many of those key workers that work for the council in shared accommodation or cramped conditions, they're not people that have a study they can go to go and work. So tackling these issues for all of the Londoners in housing need are incredibly important. We've got a planning system though that's in flux, and I wrote an article, admittedly a Labour housing blog article, saying the planning system isn't broken, it's about funding. But I think we've also seen some really obtuse kind of planning decisions recently. TfL are trying to develop car park sites in outer London for almost 100% genuinely affordable housing, and planning committees, campaigners are rejecting that. And there's, I think, no solution for high density green living that doesn't see us looking at those sites that are currently car dominated, that aren't they're not the traditional brownfield sites, because brownfield used to cover things that people really valued. But I think there is obviously a lot of grey sites in London that need to be part of London's housing solution. I think we all go out there and talk about the need to develop these homes to get to the delivery targets that have been set for us. But we're facing real challenges, I think, in our communities around how the planning system navigates that. What we also saw was the government try to up our housing targets again, based on some very dodgy methodology, in my opinion, that I think many of us have been trying to pick. I don't think that helps either. And I'm not sure that the government's current trajectory on planning reform is going to answer the questions that we've sort of set, which is how do we deliver those homes? I think they're going to further disrupt, they're going to disconnect communities, and they also put at risk, I think, the work we want to do on decarbonisation as well, because post-fact marking people's homework versus a proper planning process that embeds carbon impact, that embeds things like biodiversity, nature recovery, all the things we want to see, that I think is put at risk. And we've got to settle, we've only just seen a London plan adopted because of the high politics of dispute between the government and the mayor. So I think it's, in terms of that audit question, we've got hopefully now a planning policy baseline in London, but that uncertainty of what's to come. I've got a really good local plan that's embedded many of these policies around nature recovery and green infrastructure, and we're working on the SPDs that underpin them. But that's how to do policy making, that's how to answer these questions. And what I've always heard from developers is certainty. If you're making the kind of commitment that you opened with, Toby, on the Key Worker Fund, and Arthur's going to talk about, that needs the certainty of a planning system, a viability system, and long-term stability that will build the homes that Londoners need. Constantly tinkering around the edges and not answering the big questions around kind of funding isn't going to do that.
Thanks, Philip. Anthony, I would expect that there isn't much in that you disagree with, but do feel free to pick up on any of it, and also perhaps start addressing the issues around land acquisition. How local authorities are going about assembling the sites in order to deliver the homes that are needed.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Toby. And yeah, just to kind of build off Phil's points, and I totally agree with what he's kind of mentioned. But I think there needs to be a recognition that as councils, it's one thing to have a target, but we don't actually have the control to kind of make sure all those developments come forward. And those are kind of some of the key challenges we face. We know that planning and just bringing a site forward can be difficult. So, one, you do need that kind of political will building off that, but equally recognizing that, there is a struggle and difficulty surrounding infrastructure that can sometimes hold up sites. And, you know, I think as a council, we play much more of we play a facilitating role. We can play a much more of a facilitating role, but one that also, if we're to do that, what we do need is more powers and more control to make sure that if we do have a target, we can step in where we're not making up that target, to make sure that we're working with developers, other house builders and other people to bring forward sites so that we are staying on target. So that's kind of the things that I would expect, that in terms of reform kind of manner from that central government can kind of give us. I think we are doing our best to keep approving stuff, and just like kind of Philip said, is that, you know, we're using our local plan process to allocate sites and making sure that we can deliver housing in line with our kind of housing need. In terms of the difficulty of land acquisition, I would say, it takes a long time to kind of go through the CPO process, you know, and we're in a market space where we are ultimately competing with the market as a council and as an authority, which places several different kind of difficulties. One being that, you know, the price that a developer can kind of buy land at, it's not the same price that a council can buy land at. You know, I have a housing revenue account, and I can produce a certain amount of rent on that, on anything I build, which means, you know, I have to be really cautious on what I'm spending on land. So those are that is one of the first challenge of almost land. And if I think about kind of sites that I've kind of looked at in Greenwich, you know, first of all, I got people saying to me, well, you know, I want it at this price. Well, I can't afford it at this price because it puts a huge, massive kind of burden on my housing revenue account. And you know, if I'm at a social rent, it just wouldn't be viable. So that's something that I'm kind of struggling with. And so therefore we find ourselves in a situation where we sometimes lose out on opportunities, but also going back into that marketplace and trying to get land. You know, I have to deliver a certain amount of affordable housing as a council on public land versus also a developer who's just buying land. So my role as a public authority in terms of what I deliver on a specific site is very different condition to the private developer, which changes the whole kind of viability of any site that I'm bringing forward, and places more difficulty on myself. I think through other means, we have been quite bold in terms of doing joint ventures with other people, exploring alternative means of delivery. In Greenwich, we have a housing delivery 2018 kind of plan whereby we're focused on exploring all sorts of types of delivery methods, community-led housing, exploring cooperative housing, partnering with arm houses to support them to bring forward, you know, different types of development themselves, but also working with joint ventures. And we also have our Meridian Home Start, which is basically an arm from the council that is separate from the council, but works with us to bring forward a good private rented sector kind of offer. But one thing we do in all of these kind of areas is play that facilitating role, which does need almost what I would say a gloves off approach, whereby we are facilitating and just getting to the grips of things, because often what slows these things down is almost a bureaucracy that kind of gets involved in those kind of processes. So I think there is a need to draw out that political will. It needs to bring partners together, collaborate more, and focus on delivery and get more power for central government to be able to do that.
Great, Anthony, thank you very much indeed. Arthur, I'm going to come to you in just a second on some of those points, but before we do that, Maria, I'd like to put to you something that Philip mentioned, which is around this tension between delivering homes and sustainability and environmental concerns. How do you see that playing out as an engineer specialising in physics and sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate that is often seen as a conflict. I really don't think it is when we think more holistically about, you know, social justice, climate justice. Really, these two things are interconnected problems that have a solution that needs to come forward together. But obviously, when we're working day to day, we're just trying to, you know, achieve the projects for the kind of lowest carbon possible, and we're trying to bring these sites forward, like Anthony's talking about, you know, that working within the current systems, often there are tensions and there are difficult decisions that we have to make, and we need to sort of find the best ways to really I guess understand and articulate the issue so that we can make the best possible decisions for the short, medium and long term. But when we think more broadly, then these are a connected issue, and some of the stuff that Anthony was just talking about now around, you know, central government political will, funding and so on, really relates to both housing provision and to meeting our environmental sustainability goals as well. In terms of, you know, the thing is, the built environment is a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. It's around 40%. And when you start taking into account the carbon embodied in all of the infrastructure as well, then it just gets higher and higher. And it's an absolutely enormous part of that story. We are not going to be able to meet our carbon budgets and our 1.5 degree commitments without making big changes to the way that we currently build, operate, and plan our built environment. So it's a huge part of the equation, and that's sort of why I have my job and why so many of us are really like focused on this at the moment. And there are three kind of key things. One is around the energy that buildings use, and that's both existing buildings and new buildings. You know, so many of our existing buildings are still heated with gas, and there are carbon emissions that are associated with that. And there's a huge amount of work to do to retrofit sort of all of our existing building stock in order to better insulate it, make sure there's more energy, better energy efficiency, escape the dependency on gas, but also to address things like, you know, the cost of heating your home and fuel poverty and all of the issues that come along with that. So there's a huge project there, and there's not anywhere near enough emphasis, funding, political will to tackle that problem as well. Like, we focus so much on new buildings and making sure that the new buildings are really energy efficient, which is obviously absolutely important. But I think it's around, if you look forward to 2050, only about 20% of the buildings in 2050 are actually going to be built between now and then. The rest of them, we've already built them. They're already here. People are already living in them. So we really need to tackle those buildings now as they are in order to address all these things. And then there's also the carbon that's embodied within the new construction. So, you know, concrete, steel especially, but all materials use energy in order to extract the materials, to process them, to assemble the buildings and so on. And all of that has carbon emissions associated with it as well. And we really need to change the way that we're building as much as possible in order to address that, because both in new builds and in refurbishment works, we're still emitting more carbon associated with that. So we need to really change the way that the industry works as a whole in order to address that, whilst also tackling these really pressing housing issues. So there's a lot of work to do.
That's fantastic, Maria. Thank you. And we're going to come back to some of those themes later. I mean, there are those really interesting questions around, you know, who's going to pay for zero carbon development and the premium that involves, whether it's the eventual occupants and tenants, or whether it's upfront investment and how that's going to be recouped. And also that decision around whether you renovate or you rebuild. And there's some really interesting questions around that. We'll circle back to some of that in a bit. But first, Arthur, some comments from you on what we've heard so far around housing targets and the pressure on councils to deliver, and the difficulties and challenges they face in doing that, and that conflict between the tension between environmental concerns and delivery targets.
Absolutely. Great to be talking to you all today. So briefly, just to give a short background on Skyrim and the Key Worker Homes Fund. So we launched the Key Worker Homes Fund earlier this year, and it's £100 million provided to local authorities and housing associations to work with them in the acceleration of delivery of affordable homes for key workers. And that funding, we actually kind of set up Skyrim, launched it with this white paper we wrote in 2018, kind of outlining the need for sustainable and affordable homes for key workers back then, but that's only become increasingly apparent that need is very desperate as the kind of pandemic rages on. I think the points raised have been seriously interesting. Maria's touched on the importance of embodied carbon and operational carbon. But the point I want to kind of focus on a little bit is what Anthony and Philip were touching on in terms of land and availability, because that's just such a, when you look at the economics of housing and why housing is expensive in cities and why often we end up building unsustainable homes in unsustainable places in the country, it relies on the understanding the economics of housing. And in this white paper we published, kind of the key facts underpinning it was that the primary cost of, we always talk about the housing crisis in London, but the primary cost of renting or buying a house in a city such as London is not actually the house itself, but the land upon which it's built. I know that I can see a lot of housing experts who are joined the call today and are on it. And so Anthony's bang on in terms of saying, often when one's trying to deliver affordable housing, it's the land, and when competing for that, limited availability of land is the real trouble. So the way we're trying to approach that and work through that through the Key Work Homes Fund is recognising this, I guess, it's a much less sexy headline for The Guardian to be talking about land crisis than housing crisis. And so to really kind of recognise that and strip that back to the essentials and say, actually, local authorities and housing associations and central government are some of the biggest landowners in London. Some boroughs, for example, I live in Southwark. Southwark owns 42% of the land within the borough. I'm not sure the specific figures with Greenwich and Hackney, but it's certainly in the double-digit percentages in terms of the land ownership within those boroughs. And it's saying, obviously, there's a need to acquire more land, but also how can we make more of the land that already exists? And our specific mode and model of development is looking at infill and densifying existing sites. And so a combination of airspace development, building above existing buildings, and then also building around existing buildings to try and increase the density of sites. And we're calling that kind of incremental density. It's not looking at building kind of huge tower blocks. It's looking at adding between 2 to 4 stories to existing buildings. And in doing so, Maria, who touched on a bit around the cost there and who pays. It's often very difficult. We're with the cladding scandal, where it's obviously can't be leaseholders who continue to pay for this. Central government is spending a lot elsewhere, and so I think that there should be a reliance on some central government funding. But critically, what this £100 million is there to be able to do is to not only invest in new homes, but also actually the cyclical maintenance and the upgrade within those existing buildings, whether that's the heat, obviously a lot of it is lost through the roof, whether it's improving insulation, whether it's improving the materials that those existing buildings are made of. So it's trying to use this idea of, can we, through a project, through an airspace development or for an infill project, can we look at it more holistically and say, not only can we deliver 200, 500, 1,000 new homes to key workers, but can at the same time we improve the existing building stock whilst we're on site and really try and lift up the whole building, and in doing so provide, yes, community spaces and amenity spaces, but also that critical environmental element as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Arthur. Let's cycle back then. Philip, is there anything else that you'd like to pick up on in the conversation so far? So give you a sort of right of reply, if you like, but also to talk a little bit about how the climate emergency is influencing your policy and the delivery of homes in your borough.
Thanks. It shows the richness of the conversation, but also how we're trying to solve, I think, all of our crises in land. We will all know from our own work, whether it's as I say, as a developer or a planning authority or an enabler, the challenge of viability. So, we have a really ambitious delivery council programme in the borough. We are we've just finished adopting our local plan that has a net zero carbon policy written into it. To that challenge as a developer, while delivering council housing, while thinking about how our estates work, is an incredible challenge. And what I think we can't get away from is the land and investment criteria that we need from government to enable all of this to happen. London councils went into the sort of last mini spending review saying very clearly that there were £1 billion worth of retrofit shovel-ready projects in London that were fundable, that would help create green jobs, that would help boroughs like Hackney retrofit some of our existing buildings and make them warmer and address that social justice issue. Because I think Maria is absolutely right. The climate and housing are critical social justice issues, but it's how I started, but they're often seen only through the market. And, as a developer, I know that as a council, if house prices fall, if rents fall, it's a lot harder to deliver the cross subsidy that's needed to build the council housing we need to see. As a private renter, as someone that really welcomes the fact that rents are falling in London, and as somebody that's looking at my front door in terms of people approaching the council in housing crisis, allowing benefits and wages to catch up with rents would reduce the impact of fewer people in temporary accommodation. So these are all really tricky things to unpick. I think on net carbon, one of the things that we're doing using our local plan, and we've I think being really clear and ambitious is recycling some of the offset funding from developments that don't meet our carbon targets into retrofitting existing stock and creating funds for Hackney residents, whether they're tenants or owners, to start making their homes more sustainable and green. And so I think, making those links, as Arthur was saying, between development and the wider community benefit, not just seeing it all within the existing development, because I think we can have very high environmental standards, we can have very good space standards, we can embody play, we can create jobs, but if they don't have that wider impact on the wider community, people still say, who was that for? And I think we really do have to think about how new development fits into that wider community. We also, I think, need to, as Maria was saying, work with the industry to develop the types of technologies we need, both on construction and retrofit, because my experience of these programs when I was cabinet member for housing in the last decade was very high ambitious targets, a rush to complete them, using big contractors, often spending huge amounts of public money, not quite getting it right, not creating the skills within our organisations or within our communities to maintain that investment. And I don't think we can repeat that. We need to have a journey to 2040 that allows us to get the green skills in London, that allows us to create technology that end users can use, that doesn't, and you raised the challenge, who pays? We can't have vulnerable Londoners paying for really complex buildings, as we've seen with the cladding scandal, or technology that has to be ripped out in 10 years' time. And that goes for tenants, it goes for leaseholders, and it goes for landlords, because the positions within our HRAs, as Anthony said, are now facing the need to deal with fire safety, to decarbonise our homes and make them more sustainable, and still build new council housing. Wherever the money comes from, that still needs to be paid back. And I think we have to recognise those three elements if we're to go forward with credibility.
Thanks, Philip. And Anthony, there are a lot of threads in there. You've got a challenge on your hands to pick up on them, but feel free to be selective. And perhaps also addressing what Philip was saying around skill retention. We've got a really exciting program of events coming up over the next year. We've got a quarterly series on direct delivery and how councils are expanding and accelerating direct delivery of housing themselves and building those skills bases. So we can focus more on that in those sessions. But Anthony, if you could start to like I said, pick up on any threads, but start to address something that Maria pointed out, which is that 80% of the buildings we're going to end up with are already built. So how are we going to start making the decision about what to knock down, what to retrofit, and the costs that are involved with that decision?
Yeah, thank you for that. And, just to kind of pick up from where Philip left off, I totally agree. So in Greenwich, we've got a 750 home house building home program. And, our aim is for it to all be zero carbon. So most of them are, and that's what we're kind of delivering and making sure we're bringing forward. And just on reflection of it, like the key issues with kind of going down that road, using modular, seeking to make sure that your housing is kind of green, is almost that supply chain. Ensuring that your deliveries are turning up on time, so it's not impacting your kind of construction process, ensuring that your modular housing is being brought forward and actually being delivered, but also understanding that there are still almost emitters in that process of construction, and actually how do we change that around. And I was just kind of thinking and reflecting on that. I remember reading one time how a house, a modular builder was looking to just almost create a micro hub in the area where they were building. And that's a great opportunity to kind of, tap on and bring jobs to the area, but also understanding you can kind of move around as you're kind of developing areas, which also makes it more sustainable, rather than putting stuff on a lorry and bringing it all the way down. So there's just several things you can do utilizing that supply chain to kind of pick up on those kind of things. In terms of kind of retrofitting all those kind of areas, I think first of all, there needs to be a recognition of what needs to be retrofitted versus what doesn't. Quite right, that needs to be focused on how we, what analysis we have on our assets, and what information we have, because we want to be making sure we're making those kind of right decisions on what is worth retrofitting. so I would kind of say that's the first point. On the second point is almost what I would kind of say is bringing residents along with us during that process. Why should my next door neighbor care? You know, it's one, you know, we've got I remember doing a kind of a survey in my area when I was going and knocking around doors, just talking about, you know, transport in the local area. And, you know, for them, they just want to be able to, you know, wake up, live in a great house, be able to travel and get on with their kind of jobs. But why should they care that they are using less energy and all of these other things? Obviously, everyone kind of wants to do that, but ultimately, that kind of drive to that destination is very difficult, you know, and can be expensive. And what we don't want to do in that process is kind of destabilize / make more problems for tenants who are more socially vulnerable. And the key issue there is making it affordable to kind of retrofit, and making it affordable to kind of have the kind of tools that you have on an estate that make it more energy efficient, but ensure that it's cost effective for our residents. So, you know, we know that gas is cheaper than electricity. And I think there's still various ways in which that can be done and can work. But I think with a good asset management strategy, we can understand what good stock looks like and understand when it's worth retrofitting. But equally, I think there needs to be a lot of work done with engaging with our communities. You know, why should my next door neighbor want solar panels and air source heat pumps, and what do they do? You know, it's a really, really important question. Why should people like me care? You know, it's one thing to say the climate emergency, but how we live that out practically in our lives it's different and means different things to all of us. So it's a big question for me about, you know, as a councillor, as an authority with a responsibility to deliver. There's a social aspect of the delivery that comes into it, and, you know, how do I do that? And I think that's something that we need to figure out, because we're very much strategically focused. We're very much focused on the delivery, but actually there's more work to be done about changing attitudes, and that can be quite challenging.
That's a really interesting point. I'm going to come to Maria on that just in a second, but Philip, did you want to pick up on something there?
Yeah, just a quick 30 seconds. There's 4 points blocks about 500 meters from where I've sat now. And they're exactly what Anthony's described has happened to them over the last 30 years. So when their original communal heating was decommissioned, I think in the 80s or 90s, they got night storage heaters, which was electric. That was how we were going to heat our homes, most efficient, cheaper. People on prepayment meters, by the time that system failed, were paying nearly £3,000 a year to heat their homes. We then used CESP funding to install a gas CHP, reclad the block, and do the kitchens and bathrooms in a kind of decent homes plus. During that time, people had explored whether regeneration or demolition was the right solution. And now, as Anthony said, we're going to come back and probably have to decommission that gas heating system and make sure that the affordability is still embedded in. That community has been sort of experimented on by kind of the vagaries of national policy now for 30 years. And I think there will be a fatigue and an uncertainty, and ultimately what people want to know is, how much is it going to cost to heat my home if I'm on a prepayment meter? Are you going to make profit out of me? Are you going to knock me down? And I think that trust that you need to reopen some of those conversations and do it with credibility just has to be there, whatever decisions we take.
It's absolutely brilliant point that both of you have made. And Maria, there's something really interesting in this, isn't there? You're a director of sustainability and physics. You made a really good career choice, right? At some point, you decided you were going to go down this line, and here we are at the right time. You're the right person at the right place at the right time. But it's quite an intimidating job title as well for those of us who are sort of more immersed in the arts than the sciences. And there is that issue around communication, isn't there? That this is all some sort of techie scientific thing that is going to be extremely expensive and benefit somebody else. So what's your view on the kind of the communication, the engagement sort of side of this conversation? And also, we've got UN sustainability goals, we've got climate emergencies, we've got all of these things in place. Are they really having an impact? Are you seeing this being played out in buildings that are being put together right now?
I think one thing I wanted to say was picking up on something that Anthony said, and I think it's really problematic and difficult how so often it feels like this big problem, this existential crisis of a climate emergency that we have, is like being pushed onto us as individuals. Like, oh, you as an individual need to change your behavior, or you as an individual need to retrofit your home, you know, like you need to stop using plastic straws. And it's like really pushed down onto us. And I just think that's really, really unhelpful. And, you know, we need to much more think about how we can collectively change things, how we can collectively change the broader system. And I think in terms of the way that that's communicated, that things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals are really helpful, because they've become sort of really well known broadly. We understand that actually these 17 things are really, really important to us as a society, as a kind of a huge global society. And these are the things that we need to tackle directly. It's not just that we need to look after the economy and hope that the economy will look after everything else. I think we know that doesn't work. And we've seen that so cruelly over the course of this pandemic as well, that just looking after the economy and then hoping that that's going to sort out everything else isn't working. And so we need to tackle stuff like, you know, exactly as the Key Worker Homes Fund is talking about, we need to tackle this thing directly. We need to tackle environmental damage directly. We need to tackle biodiversity directly. And I think that's a much more helpful way, quiet polls, that's a much more helpful way of thinking about this, that we can work together to solve all of these problems and find the sort of the ways in which they interact with each other. And I think some of the communications and the way that we're hearing, like the young people picking up on this and talking about those things directly, really is showing that that's gaining momentum. And personally, over the last kind of few years of my career, we've seen the way that developers and clients and architects and people are talking to us has changed enormously. And I think it's tremendously hopeful, but it is because of that shift in the conversation that we're always thinking, okay, how can we make this the most sustainable project ever? How can we make sure that we're maximizing every opportunity for sustainability, and in a holistic way as well, like not just thinking about carbon emissions, obviously massively important, but also thinking about biodiversity and habitats and ecology, and then also thinking about social value. And like one of the things that Philip said, this like, who is it for? Like, who is this project actually for? We're seeing increasingly clients and developers wanting to talk about the social value and actually measure properly the social value that a project generates. And who are the stakeholders that this project is actually affecting? It's not just the people that are going to live in those homes or work in those offices. It's all of the people around that area, all of the people who are involved in making those buildings, all of the people who are involved in maintaining them or making products like far away that are then going to be used to maintain those. And so like understanding that the red line, if you like, of the project is actually much, much broader, and all of these things are interconnected and we can tackle them directly. It makes our jobs more difficult, but much more exciting and much more likely to tackle some of these big issues.
And more fulfilling, I would guess, as well. Arthur, there's lots of rich material for you to pick up on there, but there's also a technical question that's coming from Stephen Hill around tall buildings and energy use. So Stephen's asking what you make of Professor Stedman at UCL's evidence about CO2 emissions in tall buildings, about the optimum rates per square metre, both in compact developments up to 6 stories, but those rates have doubled by the time you get to 20 stories. So how do you justify increasing the height of a building knowing that?
I'm not actually familiar with that specific piece of research, but if you can ping a link to it, I'd be very, very interested to read it. I'm actually a visiting professor at UCL, so I'll make sure I get my hands on Professor Stedman and get to the bottom of it. Broadly, we're looking at a land usage case and a retrofit case more generally in terms of how one can increase density of a specific site, and in doing so, increase the performance of the existing building, and then also increase the operational carbon of the people who live in that building. So we all know the data from books such as Triumph of the City and others around how relying on and also the 15-minute city, around how being close to where one works, being close to where one plays and existing social networks are, and not having to rely on cars is critical. So building in the centre of cities, and especially if you can build above existing buildings rather than on greenfield or brownfield sites, has a huge impact there. But that specific piece in terms of the heating rates and depending on the height of the building, I'm not familiar with, but I'll be very interested to check it out. I think just to pick up very briefly on Maria's point as well, which is so interesting and bang on, I've actually just finished a book, and this is a book plug for another UCL professor, Mariana Mazzucato, who I'm sure many of the audience are familiar with, who's just published a book called Mission Economy. And this is a really interesting book for policymakers in particular, around how these seemingly nebulous grand goals, as you referred to, Toby, the UN, the 17 SDGs, which are all kind of vague in their ambitions and scary in their scope, and how one can start thinking about it from, you keep your mission central, and then you build these sub goals that are often in cross-sectional between them. And so I'd as it's just been published, and I'd recommend that members of the audience and panel pick up a copy, because it's very interesting.
Great stuff. Thanks, Arthur. Anthony, so coming back to you, how mission central is all this? Are you successfully building, do you think, strategy and policy so that you can deliver on sustainability and climate goals while also delivering the housing targets? And also the really interesting issue that Maria brought up there around social impact. And there's a question in from David Hutt in the audience about adopting the construction playbook. I mean, is that going to move us all in the right direction, do you think? Is government doing the right thing by giving us some more guidelines that ask us, require us to address the social impact of development?
So almost just to kind of pick up on a few things, I think policy-wise, we're seeing local authorities make that shift. We're kind of doing the work that we need to do with our climate action plans, using that local plan process to really bring forward development. And retrofitting where possible, like I said, focusing on that analysis. In terms, one thing I did want to mention in regards to social values, I think social value is great. I think it's one of those terms that we all kind of use, but it means different things again to all of us. And I think, we need to make sure that we connect social value with projects and the people that are around those projects, because I can write a report and put, this is the best social value that kind of comes out of it. But if I knock on a resident's door and say, did you feel that social impact? What would their answer be? I think there's a way to kind of look at it in that kind of scope there. Arthur was talking about 15-minute neighborhoods and 20-minute things, and I actually think Greenwich is a good example of that. So if we look at North Greenwich and kind of that policy around polycentric cities, and making sure you have everything in proximity to where you live, so you have your residential, you have your social, you have your commercial, you have your kind of work life, and you also have your transport. So I think we've kind of started to develop that, and I think that's a great kind of shift in that we need to start thinking about it. We're seeing lots more institutions and authorities kind of talking in that regard. I think that it's a great thing to do, but I guess almost the danger sometimes is about, again, some of those kind of spaces is who has access to them, and what we don't want to do is create those kind of invisible inequalities that we're going to find out that exist in the future. So yes, it's great, but I think we need to make them more affordable, and kind of make sure that we're getting a good balance between affordable in those kind of areas, so actual people who are more socially vulnerable can live in such spaces, where you have those kind of infrastructures, where you have that office kind of offer. How affordable is it to live in those spaces? As someone that, you can see me in my room, but I can bet you any bet, at some point my mum's going to come through, because I'm one of those people. But could I kind of afford to live in that place? Probably not. And that's where that kind of balance that balance is needed versus public sector versus private sector, and ensuring that we're getting that balancing out of the kind of housing market in such areas.
Thanks, Anthony. Philip, I think a lot of this is around, you've got the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns going forward, and we're trying to build now, make decisions now for things that we don't quite understand in 50 years from now. So it'd be interesting your thoughts on how much thinking you put into that sort of thing, but also around this issue of social value. The construction playbook is supposed to ask us to decide what those common values are, what social value is, and agree on that, and then ensure that that's going to be delivered through development. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on the art of the possible there. And then finally, affordability. That's the other thread that's just popped up. And Alan Crawford in the audience is saying that the problem with much of what's mooted to be affordable in the provision of social housing is that it isn't affordable, particularly in the shared ownership model. So maybe you'd like to address that as well.
Thanks, Toby. Another set of huge questions.
Yeah.
You rightly identify. So my view, as 15 years odd campaigning around these issues and being mayor for the last 4.5 years in Hackney is, you know, for the vast numbers of Hackney residents, the only thing that's genuinely affordable is a council home or social rent home. And if you don't start there, then I'm not doing my job. And I'm also not going to be able to have the broader conversations that then move into key worker, intermediate, living rent products that play a huge part in moving people out of the private rented market or people out of their childhood bedrooms or shared housing, or allow them to come to London in the first place. But you have to start with the people that are on our housing register and those people that are overcrowded on our estates, and that's what I'm really proud to do. I still believe in shared ownership. I still believe in living rent products. I believe in key worker housing. Someone asked in the chat, what do I mean by that? One of the things we've done in Hackney is make it about income, because I don't think you can choose between somebody working in the private sector as a nursery nurse or a teacher or a teaching assistant or nurse or mental health practitioner, or someone working in the third sector, or even someone starting their career as an architect or an apprentice or whatever. It's about income. They all make our city work. So that's one of the things we've sort of changed, rather than maintaining a kind of artificial key worker list that may have been based around being a public sector worker. However important their contributions are, because some people in the public sector obviously earn a lot more than some of the professions in the private sector. On the broader question, we have to be really ambitious, and we have to, as Maria said, make the right policy decisions and set out this journey. If we fail, we will fail Londoners, and we'll fail the poorest Londoners, and we will not meet those climate obligations we've signed up to. So those climate emergency declarations that boroughs made, I think 28 made them in London. We take that incredibly seriously at London councils. We take it very seriously here at Hackney Council, and I'm really pleased to be co-chairing the Green New Deal Recovery Board with Shelley Rodriguez, the Deputy Mayor at the GLA. That we all have to play our part. And the interesting thing about the polling that London councils did is Londoners also recognise they have to play their part. They want to see leadership, but they also want to know how they can make a difference. And I think it's really important that we do that. We have really started our decarbonisation journey from the council to show that leadership as well. I don't think you can ask other organisations to do things you're not willing to do yourself. So whether it's decarbonising our fleet, how we generate our energy, how we buy our energy, how we use our energy, making sure that we've got very high quality policies very rapidly, and that we're not just saying we're declaring climate emergency and we'll sort it out in the 2030s. We're going to make the changes that we can make now, and then work with others to think about the technologies we'll need in 2030. But just to finish, the problem is that I don't think the level of investment ambition from anyone is high enough yet. You know, the announcements at the end of last year about £1 billion, I think, from government, that might get us to 2026. It's not going to get us to 2040 in terms of the things that we're talking about here. So I think we've all got to make the case for the long-term investment, both from business, local authorities, national government, and citizens in this journey, and lead that path with active citizens around how we can solve these problems together.
Fantastic, thanks, Philip. Peter Redshaw in the audience, you've raised your hand. I'm afraid I'm a real autocrat in these sessions, and it's only our panel that takes the stage. But if you want to get a question to them, do fire it through the Q&A, and we'll put it to them during the conversation. Arthur, is there anything in there that you'd like to tease out in particular?
I think it's the point around funding, and Glanville was absolutely right that there's definitely not enough funding out there, and also to the point around kind of walking the walk and talking the talk. There's a huge amount of chat, and part of the reason that we raised the Key Worker Homes Fund is to try and put our money where our mouth is. So the £100 million, this is definitely not enough money. This is a drop in the ocean in terms of what the final answer required for this is, and £1 billion from government again is not enough money. So it's around both the private sector, the public sector, government, etc., all trying to come together to be able to provide the capital and also the technical knowledge and skills available to try and unlock this. So £100 million in particular for the Key Worker Homes Fund is basically to try and kickstart those early stage of projects. As I'm sure everyone on this call understands that often once you've got a project to a certain stage, it's quite relatively easier to fund. You have a appraisal, you've got a site, you've got a you've done your community engagement, you've gone through the planning process, and then you can go to, the public sector obviously have their means and the private sector have their means, and you go to relatively established lenders and providers who can then go and deliver that. The hard part we found through our conversations with a lot of housing leads or people like in central government as well, is that in those early stages, how do you, Anthony was talking around how do you find out what the building stock currently is and where suitable development could be? How do you fund those pieces, which can often be lost leaders? How do you fund a planning application or a series of pre-apps or a design team to really kind of begin that process early on where there's not yet a return on investment that's qualified? And that's where we, from our feedback, we found that the £100 million can often be best spent to try and kickstart thousands of homes for key workers to be built across London. And we're already working with a number of major local authorities and housing associations to do that early stage work. And then either there's the option to continue for the Key Work Home Fund to fund the entire delivery of the project, or then to go through the more traditional procurement methods of saying, actually, we're going to put this out to tender, we're going to go to central government and borrow the money, or whatever it happens to be. So we're trying to provide, it's a £100 million, definitely not enough, but it's a start, and we're trying to put our money where our mouth is and to try and kickstart these projects, get some energy behind them, and then the decision makers within these organisations will then be able to decide how they want to take it forward.
Thanks, Arthur. Okay, so Maria, let's just cycle back a little bit to what Philip was just saying. And can you tell us if you're seeing climate emergency playing out in delivery, in actual projects on the ground as part of your work? And also, we've got something in from an anonymous attendee, which is often quite ominous. Rather than anonymous, but I think it's a really good point, and it plays into the current procurement green paper, which is are you seeing procurement processes reflecting supporting the need to deliver net zero and also social value?
Yeah, so I mean that's a really good question. I think the design processes that we have, or the kind of workflows that we go through, and this speaks to Arthur's point just now as well. Like, there's up front, there's a lot of work that needs to be done that's kind of quite difficult. It's quite risky. It's sort of it may not lead to anything, but it may lead to something brilliant. And so, and it's in integrating climate emergency and social value aspirations also fits into that early stage work where we need to find out, for example, if you want to build a building that delivers a bunch of homes, but also maybe offers employment to local manufacturing facilities, for example, or in some way makes best use of the skills in that area, then you need to do that research, do that mapping, understand not only where there's land available, but also where there are skills available, or also where there are people who are going to be benefiting from education, upskilling and training available, bringing all of that in before anything has been designed. The design process is no longer just a blank piece of paper and some genius, does a squiggle, and then you kind of go together and then you just, oh yeah, I'll find the money, I'll find and then it all just happens. It does not like that at all, but there's still this image of it being like that. Actually, it's much more, a lot of upfront stuff. If we're going to embed the circular economy, for example, then when you're starting to design a building, you need to first take, okay, what resources have I got? Well, I've got that building over there that's been empty for 10 years because it's completely unusable in the way that it is, but it's made of all this brilliant built fabric that actually we can reclaim, remanufacture and use that. So I need to incorporate that into my design. There's these people over here who are making windows in this way. So let's make sure that we design the building so that they can make the windows. And then, there's those local economic benefits to that, and also local, minimizing carbon on imports and transport and so on. So all of those kinds of processes, that mapping and understanding of what your local context is for climate emergency and social value, have to go into that upfront work. And it's really, really difficult to get funding for that. So it's brilliant that this kind of approach is coming forward to to help us entrench and embed that kind of thinking right at the beginning. And because it changes the design process that we've become used to, and it changes the kind of the key gateways for decision making that we've been used to. So it's disrupting the system, but we are starting to see it more and more. And I'm hopeful that things are shifting in the way that we need them to.
We're dependent a lot on the data that's available, as you've sort of alluded to there, aren't we? And Arthur, presumably that sort of approach plays right into your hands as a disruptor developer. You're looking at those infill sites, those individual cases where airspace development is going to be appropriate.
Exactly, yeah. So it's really looking at saying that we can't do it alone. councils can do it alone. They're proving they can do it alone at a huge, huge scale. But often there are niche modes of development, like airspace development, where a bit of extra money, some technical support can make all the difference, especially in modes of development which are more technically challenging, or that there is more emphasis on things like community engagements, and often they can be more expensive, as Maria touched on, in those early stages. So it's really a call to housing associations, local authorities saying, if you would like some pro bono technical support, if you'd like to explore £100 million in funding to accelerate delivery of key worker homes, this resource is available, and we're on the edge of our seats to work with Greenwich, with Hackney, with a number of the inner London boroughs to try and kickstart this movement.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm kind of come back once more round the table, starting with Philip. If you want to tie up any of those threads, we'd welcome your comments. But I'd also like a final thought from you, if you will. Philip, what policy would you design or implement? What single policy would you design or implement to yield long-term resilience for the planet and people? If you could pick one thing and it would happen tomorrow, what would it be?
That is a very tough question. I think stable funding. It's not glam. It's not decarbonise our energy tomorrow. It's not, to make all vehicles EV. I think it's funding meets policy. So if we're going to remove diesel, for instance, I know it's not a planning thing, but we want to get to zero emission cars by 2030. We want to put the infrastructure in place. We want to shape the market. We want to help consumers. We need to do that in a way that allows a just transition, that doesn't make it a culture war. And I think none of us have really talked about that, but a lot of the work that we're trying to do here has a backlash because people are fearful and people don't think it's for them. And I think Anthony talked about that quite vividly, about people sort of saying, well, why should I care about this? I think we have to connect those themes together and make sure that we're doing this with social justice, social value at its heart. So unless we are going to, as a society, really commit to this, I think we will fail those most vulnerable and get that back. Even Oslo has seen a backlash about their EV vehicle work and the toll ring, I think we just have to really avoid that sort of culture war piece. I think we have to recognise that we can't necessarily do it all in one development. I think we have to be really honest about that when you get into the granularity of what we're trying to achieve. I think some of the portfolio approaches work really well. We've been really clear in Hackney. We haven't talked about other types of infrastructure, but there will be boroughs that are trying to build schools, that are trying to do transport infrastructure, that are trying to do mixed use developments around employment space. These are all competing demands within that red line that Maria talked about. And I think you have to sort of recognise what you're trying to achieve and be really upfront and transparent. And the worst thing, I think, is the sort of wiggly line-based consultation where you get all that vivid feedback, and then you just get a generic housing development. Yeah. And it's not the people on this call, but the industry still attempts to deliver that. And I think we need to see that change fundamentally as we go forward.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Philip, for that. And Anthony, again, feel free to tie up any loose ends for us, but also a single policy that you could design or implement and have it enacted tomorrow to yield long-term resilience for the planet, for the planet's people.
Well, I don't know if I can wrap that all up in a single policy, but ultimately, I think we just need to be more proactive in how we use our land, in how we use our space, in how we kind of redevelop places, and almost making sure that we bring the change that is needed to our planning process. We're currently building, and therefore we need to be building homes and places that are in the dates that we want to get to for our climate action plan, and we have to focus on that now. So we have to get that change in policy from national government to kind of ensure that we got the right homes and the sustainable homes that we need in the future, and we also need to ensure that we're bringing a lot more investment into infrastructure that can ensure that we have that kind of 20-minute neighborhood living processes, and a big part of that is funding, is about collaboration, and is about taking your gloves off and banging heads in a room and getting on with the job.
Yeah, fantastic. I see a bit of mission creep there already. The 15-minute city has become a 20-minute city before we've even built it. But yeah, banging heads together. It's a fantastic way to visualize this. Philip mentioned that we haven't spoken at all about the culture war, and we haven't spoken about anything except residential development. I feel, to be fair to us, we've covered a lot of ground today, but there's so much more to do. Maria, if you could implement a single policy tomorrow to yield long-term resilience, what would it be?
Oh, nothing big, just a like perfectly integrated environmental and economic raft of legislation that makes sure we hit our carbon budgets and meet the Paris Accord. That's all.
That's the kind of vision and leadership we need, Maria. Thank you very much. Arthur, are you in a position to deliver that?
We are a very, very, very small piece of that pie, but as I think this call's touched on, it's around different sectors and different kind of, different organizations all trying to work together for the same outcome. And I think if I was to answer that question, Toby, around what my single piece would be, I think it's around, we've spoken a lot around how we build, where we build, and what the homes are like to live in, but also who lives in those homes, I think is critical as well. And our mission at Skyrim is around delivering homes to key workers near to where they work. And that's what we're really, really excited about. I know that there's a lot of talk in both central and local government around key worker first housing policies. And it's been something that's been in and out of vogue for several decades now. But I think it's the time to put key workers first and to make sure that they get the tenure types and the homes they need.
Fantastic, Arthur, thanks. And I hope that this series of 3 webinars has got that conversation well and truly going for you as well. But that is the last word in that conversation, both for today and for this series. We've got to let our viewers get out for a bit of daily exercise, their ration of daily exercise, or to grab some lunch, or more likely to join another Zoom call. But before you do that, viewers, please join me in thanking our terrific panel for sparing their valuable time and sharing their knowledge and experience with us today. It's been a real treat. Thank you, Philip Glanville, Mayor of Hackney, and thank you to Councillor Anthony Okereke of the Royal Borough of Greenwich, and thank you to Maria Smith of Bureau Happold, and thank you, Arthur Kay from Skyrim and the Key Worker Homes Fund, both for your contribution to the conversation and for your kind sponsorship, which has made this conversation and event possible. But most of all, as ever, viewers, thank you out there for turning up again and gracing us with your attention and fueling the conversation with your stimulating questions. I'm sorry so many are left hanging, but we were covering a lot of ground today. I'm going to impose on our panelists and put those questions to them by email and ask them if there are any that they'd be happy to respond to by email. And we'll put those back to you through the LinkedIn Members Club, where you'll find those responses circulated over the coming days. If you join that club, you'll also get an early heads up on the compelling themes and topics we're going to be exploring next. The first of those is next Tuesday at 2 p.m, when we're back with Wilmot Dixon to talk about how COVID-19 is shaping thinking around creating safe spaces for learning. So register for that and watch the video of this and all our other sessions at thevoiceofauthority.co.uk. Until Tuesday, from our fabulous panel, from Skyrim and the Key Worker Homes Fund, from me and from everyone at 3 Fox. Good afternoon.